This is Composers Forum with Martin Bookspan, where men and women involved in contemporary music listen to and discuss the music of our time.
Our man of music on today's Composers Forum program is William Mayer, a native of New York City. Mr. Mayer lives in one of the suburbs of New York. He has degrees from both Yale University and the Mannes College of Music. Bill, were you at Yale when Hindemith was on the teaching staff in the composition department?
No, I wasn't, Marty. I think Hindemith was on leave, but I had a man called Mr. Baumgarten, and it was a very difficult course. I remember that.
The reason I ask is that, and I shall leave the gentleman in question nameless, but one of your colleagues in a previous Composers Forum program who studied at Yale with Hindemith said that it was probably the most wasted period in his life, that he learned nothing from Hindemith, that Hindemith was an egocentric, European-type teacher who required everything be done his way, and any other way was absolutely inadmissible.
Well, he left his legacy there, that was for sure. Tremendous amount of discipline, but not too much joy in music. That was the problem, I felt.
And I wonder if that very quality that you described, lots of discipline without an overflowing amount of joy, is not a characteristic of the music of Hindemith himself.
As I think about that, I think what I said was slightly unfair. I think there is some joy there. I think some of his disciples took Hindemith almost too seriously in terms of Hindemith.
Yes. Well, we're here to talk about William Mayer, so I think let's leave Hindemith to others and concentrate on your output, Bill. On the program today, we're going to have a varied collection of material, some orchestral music, excerpts from a piano concerto, from a piano sonata, chamber music for brass, chamber music for flute and strings, which indicates that you've written in practically every conceivable medium.
Well, I guess I've always wanted to be the all-around man. The problem is not to be too wide. And this is my philosophy.
You were saying before we took to the air that it was some of the lighter side of your output that really got the more concentrated concert music going. How did that come about?
Well, as a kid, I always loved show music. Played show music. My father would play classical, and I enjoyed that too. But secretly, I always loved show music best. Then, after Yale, I did quite a lot of writing of children's music. And one day, I met Thomas Sherman, and he was terribly interested in that, and showed him a piece called The Greatest Sound Around. It was an animal contest in which each animal tries to make the most beautiful sound in the world. And the giraffe wins because there is silence. And Tom enjoyed that very much and wanted me to orchestrate the work. And that led to another work called Hello World, which Mrs. Roosevelt narrated later on.
And recorded.
And recorded for RCA, that's right. I had quite a few serious compositions with me. Tom Sherman wasn't that interested at that time, but I've always felt that children's music is a marvelous backdoor for a composer to introduce his more serious things.
Speaking of more serious things, Bill, we're going to begin musically with one of your most recent works, the Octagon for Piano and Orchestra, which is actually a piano concerto in many movements. How many movements, Bill?
8 movements. It sounds almost greedy.
And we'll hear 2 of them, the 5th and 7th.
That's right.
Now, this was premiered in 1971, if I remember correctly.
Right.
With William Masellos and
marvelous
Stokowski.
pianist.
Yes. As a matter of fact, Masellos has recorded a couple of your pieces, hasn't he?
Yes, he has. He's recorded the piano sonata and hopefully Octagon.
Yes.
All we need is the money and the record company.
Tell us about these 2 movements from Octagon before we hear them.
Well, I would say the 5th movement is the arch movement of the work. It's romantic, mysterious at times, and interspersed is a rather playful barbarism, if there is such a thing, to kind of give a touch of motion to the work. Many different elements go on, but I would say that the mysterious element, which shows up in the very beginning, and incidentally Bill Masellos plays this beautifully, I would say that is the center of the work. It's a little bit like a rondo because this element that shows up is somewhat like a crystal curtain. It drops down, comes up, between the various episodes. And it closes that way. I would still say, though, that the kernel is not mysteriousness, but just plain romanticism.
And how about the seventh movement?
The seventh really gives one, or at least it gives me a feeling of bells underwater. I don't know why I think of that. I've always loved the sound of bells. I think all composers have. But these are very murky sounds. It's a movement of half shades and lights. It's called points and lights. And for me, it makes me think at times of light skittering on the top of a lake surface. I'm getting very poetic about all of this, but I do feel that words are very close to music.
And obviously you must feel that music can be very pictorial at times and evoke images in the listener.
Very much so. I know for a while program notes were out, and it was very dangerous to be too programmatic. My feeling is that the total experience is the important thing. And even if, for instance, if it's a hot night and you're at a concert, and if you take your shoes off, that's part of your total experience. And I think the same is true in terms of reading program notes of images. I don't think it's a central part, but I mean, after all, we experience everything totally, and I think it's a mistake to think that we can separate sound from the other associations. And so, in a sense, Octagon represents this way of thinking.
Here, then, are those two movements from Octagon. The fifth and seventh movements. The pianist is William Masellos, and Leopold Stokowski conducts the orchestra. We've heard the fifth and seventh movements from Octagon, the eight-movement piano concerto by our guest on today's Composers Forum program, William Mayer. William Masellos was the pianist, and Leopold Stokowski conducted the American Symphony Orchestra. Bill, for one of your most recent works, Octagon was composed in 1971, to the earliest of your works that we'll be hearing on today's program, the first movement of your piano sonata that was composed in 1959.
Well, actually, Marty, Octagon did get composed in 66 and 67, but it takes so very long before a composition can get launched. This is the problem.
I see, so that there was about a 4 or 5 year
4 or 5 year gap, but that's
Right.
about normal, I
Yes.
think, with the big work.
Yes. Now to the piano sonata, which was performed for the first time in 59.
Yes.
You were telling me that it was one of your earlier and one of your few excursions into the 12-tone technique.
Right. I was very suspicious about the 12-tone technique, but it really seemed to work for this piece. I think it's important, though, to abandon a system when it's not working and be unfaithful.
And this was one of your few excursions in the 12-tone system.
Just about the only one, Marty. Sometimes I notice a theme I have really is a 12-tone theme, but it's not planned that way.
What about this first movement? What should we know about it before we hear it?
Well, I would say it's a fantasia, very free in form, opens up in a rather misty way. Gradually motion shows up. It gets more violent, more dissonant. It's a full circle, really, because it returns to that very misty opening. I know that William Masellos got quite excited when I mentioned it was a fantasia. He said he would take wild liberties, and he really didn't. It was very instinctual. He did a beautiful job, I think.
You're obviously satisfied with the performance.
Tremendously so, tremendously. He has a way of introducing rhythms and excitement in a lyrical sort of way, and I think that he gives contemporary music a very good name. There's too much talk about its being percussive and what have you, and I think when Masellos plays, you realize that there is a lot of lyricism in the best of contemporary music as well. And when there are exciting figures, he very often will give the piano weight rather than accent. And you feel that there's just one continuous line, a little bit like a giant piece of taffy.
Well, let's hear that first movement of your piano sonata, and obviously the performer is William Masellos. That was the first movement of the piano sonata by William Mayer, the performance by William Masellos. And Bill Mayer, that performance on a CRI disc brings us to another part of your active life. You're one of the officers of CRI, Composers Recordings Incorporated.
Right, Marty. I'm treasurer right now. We don't handle a tremendous amount of money there, but I think it's one of the most worthwhile enterprises there is. Our records are always in stock, even if they only sell 3 records a year, but many sell many more than that.
We've had, and in the welter of available recordings, several CRI discs have been singled out for special praise by Time Magazine, Saturday Review, and so forth. Bill, the next of your works that we're going to hear has a marvelous title. It's a work for soprano and 7 players, and the title is Hastily Formed Contemporary Music Ensemble Reveals Origins. What's that all about?
Well, it's a rather wild work. These musicians and soprano are trying very hard to be avant-garde, very dignified. They keep falling back to their origins. You will hear Salvation Army tunes. You'll hear some old jazz tunes. They're just trying so hard to be dignified, they're not quite making it. So there is a contrast between the Webernesque type of vocal line and the band that keeps falling back to a real low-down, dirty beat. So I think perhaps we should hear it.
Let's. The soprano is Catherine Rowe, and Arthur Weisberg conducts the contemporary chamber music ensemble in William Mayer's Hastily Formed Contemporary Music Ensemble Reveals Origins.
Should I? Oh, I was just going to say, should I read perhaps a few of the words, Marty? Or they're so hard.
Maybe 3 or 4 lines
all right.
just to give us an
they're
idea.
Full of cliches. The soprano starts out, to reach beyond the crest, to seek where no man has peaked before, to flout, to dare sun's blinding light, life, love, lily laughter, O time, O space, embrace me, wordless, I stand raped by silence, and then you'll hear a tremendous noise. I think that will give you an idea.
To reach beyond the crest, to seek where no one has peeped before. Oh, flout. I stand raped by
Hastily Formed Contemporary Music Ensemble Reveals Origins was the title of that work, one of 2 news items by our guest on today's Composers Forum program, William Mayer. Catherine Rowe was the soprano, and Arthur Weisberg conducted the chamber ensemble. Bill, obviously that work had lots of humor, and I think that one of the characteristics of your output in general is this quality of joyous abandon and fun in making music.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned joy, Marty. I think there are a number of humorous pieces, but some of them are very corrosively sardonic, which is fine. But I think there really is a place for animal joy and also direct lyricism. I think that, in a sense, the ruling emotions, or the chic emotions of today, are anxiety, and I think somehow we downgrade some of the other emotions, like second-class cousins or what have you, in the closet. And I do think that just plain joy is part of our heritage.
Is there any such element in the works of yours that we'll hear in the second part of the program, the brass quintet, messages for flute, string trio, and percussion, or the two pastels?
Well, not in the elegy from the brass quintet, of course, but there is a movement in messages in which the various players, including string players, make wood sounds, and hopefully you'll find that humorous. There was a member of the audience during the premiere that actually joined in, so the critic thought. But this was a plant, and he hit his own woodblock, and this fooled a number of people. I would say that particular movement, and there are little jazz flicks here and there throughout the piece. But in the two pastels is more of a lyrical, mysterious type piece, otherworldly.
Now, the elegy from the brass quintet had its inspiration from a very tragic episode.
There was a very fine young man on his way back to Oberlin who was killed in an automobile accident. It was one of those snowy nights, and they just went off the road. And this could be for anybody, of course, but the name of the young man was Peter Liebhold, very talented, and I just wanted to dedicate this particular work to him.
Was he a friend of the family, Bill?
Yes, he was. He's a terribly good friend. He went to Riverdale School, which is very close to where we live, and just one of those special boys, handsome and really brilliant. It seemed to have so much going for him. It just seemed particularly cruel.
We'll hear those three pieces of yours in the second part, but I don't think I can let you leave our studio without mentioning your son, Steve, who is a budding, performing musician on his own and doing extraordinarily well.
He certainly is, Marty. I think in a way you got to know me partly through Stephen, because Stephen won WQXR piano contest, and I wish I could play that well. That's all I can say. He's a very sensitive pianist, and occasionally I talk him into doing some of my own compositions. As a matter of fact, next month on WNYC, he will be playing two works.
And he's studying currently at the Juilliard
Yes,
School.
he is. He's in his third year with Sasha Goronitsky there. But it's a very tough profession, even tougher, I think, than being a composer, if that's possible. But we keep thinking that after we're dead, that marvelous things will happen. But I think I've been fortunate. A number of things have been happening right now. But for a pianist, that's a must, of course.
Yeah, for things to happen very early in life.
Yes, and the muscles have to be there, and the technique has to be there, and it's such a public life. I remember saying to you before, composing is such a private thing, and this is partly true of being a musician, and yet you have to be so public in exposing what you have. And so, in a sense, you have to be an adjusted schizophrenic, really. And here I am being interviewed by you and what have you, and in a sense, that's a public affair, and yet when you write, it's so private, and some of my best ideas seem to come when I'm shaving for some reason.
Well, we're going to hear some of your best ideas in the second part of the program, along with some of the best ideas that we've heard in the first part. In part two, we'll have that elegy from your brass quintet, messages for flute, string trio, and percussion, and two pastels for orchestra. But right now, a brief pause for station identification. Now, this is Martin Bookspan with the second part of our William Mayer Composers Forum program. To begin this part of the program, we'll have the elegy from Mr. Mayer's brass quintet, composed in 1965. The performers are the members of the Iowa Brass Quintet on a CRI disc. The elegy from the brass quintet by our guest on today's Composers Forum program, William Mayer. The performance by the Iowa Brass Quintet. And now we'll have what probably is the most recent of the works of William Mayer, composed in 1973. The title is Messages. The instrumentation is flute, string trio, and percussion. The performers are Paul Dunkel, flute, Eugene Drucker, violin, John Graham, viola, Fred Sherry, cello, and Richard Fitz, percussion. That was Messages for flute, string trio, and percussion by our guest on today's Composers Forum program, William Mayer. The instrumentalists were Paul Dunkel, flute, Eugene Drucker, violin, John Graham, viola, Fred Sherry, cello, and Richard Fitz, percussion. And we conclude now with Mr. Mayer's Two Pastels for Orchestra. Stanislav Skrovachevsky conducts the Minnesota Orchestra. Two Pastels for Orchestra by our guest on today's Composers Forum program, William Mayer. The performers were the members of the Minnesota Orchestra under the direction of Stanislav Skrovačevský.
This has been Composers Forum with Martin Bookspan. Composers Forum is pre-recorded and produced in New York City by Jeffrey Kaufman in cooperation with Composers Theater and WNYC. This series is made possible in part by a grant from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and is distributed by NPR, National Public Radio.